Great. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this training session on resumes, which are a great professional storytelling tool. And we're going to dive into some of the fundamentals of how you can build the best resume possible for your job search. So you've probably heard about resumes. Maybe you've already had to write one if you've applied to a job or internship in the past. So we're really going to cover what they are, why we use them, and how best to approach them. A resume, which sometimes is also called a CV or a curricula vitae, is a tool to communicate our qualifications and experiences and how those qualifications relate to a specific job opportunity. You can really think about a resume as the story of your accomplishments, but just told in a very specific format. Now, I start with this funny image. Everyone is entitled to my opinion, because I found that in the world of professional development, everyone has a different and very strong opinion on how to write and format a resume. There are also important cultural differences in the approaches to resumes. So while this session won't cover all of those differences, we're going to try and focus on some key recommendations that I find to be important across different resume types. Okay, so 6 seconds. Why do you think this might be relevant to our discussion today? Well, some research found that employers at some of the largest companies around the world will see hundreds of resumes, and the average time that they take for an initial review can be as fast as 6 seconds. So that means that when you're developing a resume, it's important to keep things super clear, simple, and specific to a role to make you stand out in a short amount of time. So let's talk first about different sections that we might include in a resume. So there isn't one rule, but generally these are the kinds of sections that you might find in a resume, and it's often in this order. In the top or somewhere in a kind of header section, you want to include your name, and you can include that in a larger font than you're using in the rest of the resume. And you'll also want to provide your contact information. I include my phone number, my email, and the city that I live in. Some folks also include their full mailing address. And really the point here is just so that they have easy access to your contact information, though often on online applications for jobs, you're providing that information elsewhere. There's also an optional section called the objective, and if you include it, it's usually coming near the top of the resume. And this is usually just no more than one sentence that describes your goal in your job search. So for instance, it could read something like, quote, seeking social impact role to support the development of young people around the globe. If you're tight on space in your resume, this can be an easy space to cut, but sometimes it's nice to just explicitly sort of state what your goals are in your job search. And obviously you want to try and tailor that to the job you're applying to. All right, so then we will usually have education near the top. This is especially true if you are younger in your career, whether you're still in school or recently graduated. It's important to lead with your education. If you're farther along in your career, then typically the education section will move closer to the bottom because your work experience will become more relevant than your educational experience. But for those of you who are on the call, I think most of you are early in your career, and so you can lead with your education section near the top. What you want to include is the name of the educational institution, the degree that you are studying for or received, and the subject matter that you focused on. You can also include your grade point average and any recognitions that you received, like if you graduated with honors, for instance, you could include that. So then comes the experience section, and this is really the most substantive section of a resume. This is where you're detailing the organizations that you've interned, volunteered, or worked with, and the roles that you've held. So if you have numerous experiences, sometimes you can split this section into two discrete sections. One that's about relevant professional experience, and then additional experiences. So the former really being the experiences that you think are most applicable to the job that you're applying for. And the additional experiences can reflect some of the other experiences that you've had in your work history, but maybe aren't 100% relevant to the job that you're applying to, but is still an interesting and important part of your work history. And in general, what you're including in these sections are details around the role that you played, the actions that you took, and the accomplishments that you've made. And we'll talk a little bit more about the substance of those in a little while. Finally, there are a number of optional sections. One of those sections is skills, where you can detail hard or technical skills that you have familiarity with, like certain technologies or softwares that you are familiar with, your foreign language abilities, or other skills that might be specific to your industry. If you have less work experience, but you have some more relevant academic experience, then you can create a section called relevant coursework. And in that, you can provide the names of the courses that show your subject matter knowledge, especially those that are relevant to your job. So that's a nice way to sort of round out your resume. There's also some other optional sections in these kind of bit near the end of your resume. That includes a section that can be on activities, honors, and awards. So this is where you can share recognition you've had, extracurricular roles that you maybe have held, leadership roles, including maybe the ways you're connected with UNICEF, and more. And then finally, if you have written anything or published any work, or if you have experience teaching, then sometimes folks will include a teaching experience or publications section at the end of their resume. Okay, so what about the substance of what you're actually writing? So, we've got these different sections that we've outlined, and especially in that experience section, it's really important to write in an intentional way. So one of the recommendations is really to try to use active verbs, which is really describing an action that assigns clear agency to you as the sort of subject and focus of this resume. So for example, if I was writing in the passive voice, I might say, the presentation was developed for the board meeting. Whereas in the active voice, I might write, developed presentation for annual board meeting. It's a small difference, but the kind of assumed subject there is you. You are the one with agency. You have taken the action, and so it's presented with that in that active language. It's also important to be specific and quantify the work that you've done. So where it's applicable, you can share specific numbers or figures of your work. So let's stick with the same example I gave. I can strengthen the sentence by saying, developed presentation for annual board meeting for 25 senior leaders to finalize $3 million budget request. You can see that I'm including specific figures to give a reader a sense of the scope and nature of what I was doing. And this can really help impress them because you're making things more specific in the reader's mind. You'll also want to include the results that you've worked on. It might feel obvious to you, but you want to be really explicit about how you directly contributed to the results that your work achieved. So let's go back to the same example. If I wanted to focus on results, I could say, developed presentation for annual board meeting for 25 senior leaders to finalize $3 million budget request, securing buy-in for new community investments to benefit 1,000 youth. Admittedly, this sentence is a little bit long and we could probably tighten it. But the point here is to show that there is an action that you took and clear results. Again, we're also including more specifics. I've included how many young people that were benefiting through this work. And it's really important because it makes it specific. The so what is there when you include the information on your results. Okay, so a few other pieces on sort of the overall substance. For the first 5 years or so of your career, at least, your resume should not be longer than 1 page. It might feel strange not to include all of the experiences you've had, but if we go back to the earlier point, sometimes resumes are seen for only 6 seconds. You really want to be able to capture the reader's attention with the most important and relevant information you can. Finally, it's important to really tailor your resume to the job that you want. So one approach is that I took and have taken in my career is that I have sort of a running document And it's basically a multi-page resume where all of my experiences are sort of held there. And then for each job that I apply to, I look back at this kind of master resume and I pull over the relevant experiences that fit into one page that are really tailored to the job that I'm applying to. Another thing that you want to try and do is incorporate keywords. So when you're applying for a job, you should have a job description. And you might notice that they're really emphasizing certain responsibilities, skills that they're looking for. You might see certain words coming up multiple times. Those are really important keywords to mirror and reflect in your own resume because you're drawing in a very clear connection between your experience and the work they expect you to do if you get this job. Okay, so let's talk about some variations in format. At the top of this session, I mentioned that there are lots of different opinions and lots of differences in formats, and that can exist across cultural and country lines as well as disciplinary lines. So let's talk about a few common variations in format. One variation is academic versus non-academic resumes. So while I recommended that in general you should keep resumes to one page, if you are applying to an academic job, for instance, applying to be a professor or a lecturer, they are willing to receive a much longer resume that's inclusive of all of your publications, research, teaching experiences, coursework. It tends to be much more exhaustive. And it's important to bring this up because in general, different industries and disciplines will have their own variations. For example, in most fields, you're encouraged to keep the formatting of a resume relatively simple. But if you're applying for something in a design field, for example, the formatting and visual appeal of your resume will be important. So you'll likely use a more creative and colorful format to show your skills. Given that variability by industry, it's important to connect with mentors and other experienced folks in your field of interest to learn more about the best ways to present your resume and frame your experience. There are also cultural differences between how we develop resumes. In the US, it's strongly discouraged to include a photo in your resume, in part to prevent discrimination based on race, gender, or other protected characteristics. But in other cultures and countries, it's actually the norm and you're expected to include a photo. So this is just another example of why it's important to research the norms in the country you're applying to a job within, and to continue to ask experienced colleagues and mentors about this. All right, and I want to end with just a few suggestions on formatting. So as mentioned, unless you're working in a design-focused industry, you're going to want to use a fairly straightforward format. For one, you want to use a standard font like Times New Roman or Calibri, and go no smaller than 10-point font. Sometimes when we say, okay, squeeze it into one page, folks will develop resumes with teeny tiny font to squeeze everything in. That doesn't help you. Try and keep it to ideally somewhere between 10 and 12-point font. What you can also do is really guide a reader's eye to the most important information through your use of bolding, italics, and indentation. This really will allow a reader to sort of jump to the most important information. So you can bold the degree you have, the names of the organizations you work for, or the titles that you have in those organizations. You can maybe underline or indent or italicize key results, key figures. You can play around with that. Whatever you decide to do, just try and be consistent in the use of that formatting across the resume. It's also just important in general to not jam that one page with tons of information. Be mindful of how much white space you have on the page. This also allows a reader's eye to go to the most important information. When we have tons of text in just a single page, it can be difficult for them to really focus on what's most important. Just a note in terms of the kind of ordering of things. Again, you can play around with the order of the sections, but what I outlined earlier is a common order. And within each section, you want to list them chronologically from most recent to oldest. This might be a little counterintuitive, but basically folks want to see your most recent experience because it tends to be often the most relevant, sometimes the most impressive as we grow through our careers. So if I'm building on my education section and I have a bachelor's and graduate degree, I'll start with the graduate degree first, then my undergraduate degree. The same for jobs. I'm going to list my current job and then more recent jobs, in decreasing chronological order. As always, make sure that you're using good spelling, correct grammar, and proper punctuation. Make sure that you are reading over your resumes before you submit them. And then just in general, if you're feeling unsure about the format to use and how to get started, Google Documents and Microsoft Word have built-in resume templates to help you get started. So, take a look at a few before you commit to one, see which ones you like, and try your hand at it. Don't be afraid to ask for help and have others review, because it is, especially if you're just getting started for the first time, an unusual format to get used to. But just remember that this is a great tool for you to be able to tell the story of your experience and your desire to have a new opportunity with the job you're applying for. So I'll pause there and thank you so much for listening.